My name is Eleanor Price. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward reliability more than visibility. I've been a project coordinator, a senior specialist, the person who remembers what others forget and fixes what quietly breaks. If you met me in passing, you might describe me as calm, polite, maybe a little reserved. Some people would say I'm easy to work with. Others might say I don't push hard enough. What they usually mean is that I don't demand attention. I've spent a long time being underestimated in ways that don't look dramatic from the outside. Not ignored completely, just overlooked. Trusted with responsibility, but not with authority. Praised for consistency, but rarely considered for advancement. I was never the obvious threat, never the loud voice in the room, never the person anyone worried might leave. And for a while, I thought that was fine. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a loud or humiliating way. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, and no heroic speeches that change everything overnight. What I'm sharing is quieter than that. It's about what happens when someone realizes, slowly and a little painfully, that being indispensable is not the same as being valued. Over the next hour or so, I'll take you through a period of my life when I outperformed nearly everyone around me without being promoted, without being acknowledged, and without being protected. I'll talk about the small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, the patterns I normalized, and the role I accepted because it was safer than challenging it. You'll hear about the point where something shifted internally, not because someone finally crossed a dramatic line, but because I stopped explaining their behavior away. You'll hear how silence, once a habit, became a choice, how preparation replaced frustration, and how change can happen without announcements, threats, or raised voices. There is no sudden win in this story. No miracle opportunity drops from the sky. What happens instead is slower, more methodical, and maybe more unsettling for the people who never thought I was capable of leaving them exposed. I'm telling this honestly, including my own mistakes and delays. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I benefited from the system even as it diminished me. And I learned, later than I wish, that emotional restraint can be mistaken for consent. If you've ever felt useful but unseen, steady but stalled, respected in theory but not in outcome, this story might feel familiar. And if you've ever assumed that the quiet person beside you would always be there, always accommodating, always patient, this story might feel uncomfortable. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized your worth only after noticing how easily others were taking it for granted? For a long time, I didn't question who I was to the people around me because the role felt reasonable, comfortable even. I was the dependable one, the person you looped in when something needed to be done the first time, the person who remembered deadlines without reminders, who caught inconsistencies before they became problems, who stayed late without announcing it, and who arrived early without asking for credit. In meetings, I was rarely interrupted, but I was also rarely invited to speak first. My ideas landed best when they were repeated by someone else, usually louder, usually with a bit more confidence layered on top. No one stole from me outright. It was subtler than that. My contributions dissolved into the room, absorbed into the team, into the process, into outcomes no one bothered to trace back to a source. If someone had asked my manager what I did, she would have said, "Eleanor keeps everything running." And she would have meant it as a compliment. I was the person people relaxed around. I didn't threaten anyone's position. I didn't posture. I didn't campaign. When projects went well, I made it look easy. When they didn't, I absorbed the strain quietly. I was rewarded with more responsibility, not more authority, more expectations, not more voice. At the time, I told myself this was maturity. I watched others, often younger, sometimes less experienced, step into visibility with ease. They spoke confidently about half-formed ideas. They took credit for the momentum they hadn't created, and they were encouraged for it, mentored, positioned. given titles that match potential more than performance. I told myself I didn't want that. I liked stability. I liked doing good work without politics. I liked being trusted. But underneath that reasoning was something more uncomfortable. I didn't believe I would be taken seriously if I asked for more. So I made myself indispensable instead. I learned systems no one else bothered to document. I became the bridge between departments that didn't communicate well. Vendors called me directly because I fixed things without drama. When people went on leave, their work quietly came to me. When something broke, I was already halfway to a solution before anyone admitted there was a problem. And because I never complained, my capacity was assumed to be endless. What's strange is that no one was cruel about it. That's what made it harder to name. There were no insults, no open disrespect, just a steady pattern of being relied on and passed over, included but not elevated, valued but not advanced. I remember one performance review in particular. My manager smiled the entire time. She praised my consistency, my attitude, my reliability. She said, "You're such a stabilizing presence." Then she slid the paper across the table, and the rating was solid but safe. No stretch assignment, no development plan, no conversation about what I wanted next. When I asked gently about growth, she said, "You're already so good where you are." It was meant kindly. It landed heavily. Over time, people stopped checking whether I wanted certain responsibilities. They just assumed I would take them. I was copied on everything, trusted with everything. And yet, when decisions were made, real decisions, I was informed, not consulted. I became background infrastructure, essential, invisible. And the thing is, I participated in that. I trained people to see me this way. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I fixed something instead of flagging the pattern. Every time I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. I told myself that recognition would come eventually, naturally, as a result of excellence. That someone would notice the imbalance and correct it. But systems don't correct what benefits them. So this is who I was to them. Not a threat, not a leader, not someone they worried about losing. I was the constant, the buffer, the silent guarantee that things would work out. And at that stage in my life, I didn't yet understand how dangerous that perception could become. The first time I noticed it, I almost dismissed it out of habit. It wasn't a major incident, no raised voices, no public slight, just a small moment that landed wrong and stayed with me longer than it should have. We were in a cross-department meeting, 8 people, a long table, laptops open. I had spent the previous week consolidating data from 3 teams, correcting inconsistencies, and flagging a risk that hadn't yet surfaced on anyone else's radar. When the meeting started, my manager asked one of the newer leads to walk everyone through the analysis. He hesitated briefly, then pulled up slides I recognized immediately. My structure, my summaries, even my phrasing lightly reworded. I waited for a nod in my direction. Thanks to Eleanor for pulling this together. It never came. As the discussion unfolded, people asked him questions I knew the answers to because I'd already written them in the notes he'd skimmed an hour earlier. He answered some correctly, some vaguely. When he stumbled, I filled in the gaps gently, framing it as clarification rather than correction. No one reacted. The meeting moved on. Afterward, in the hallway, someone said to him, "Nice job pulling that together." He smiled, a little embarrassed, and said thanks. He didn't look at me. I told myself it didn't matter. Credit wasn't the point. The work got done. The risk was addressed. That was enough. But something about that moment didn't sit right. Not because of ego, but because it revealed how interchangeable my effort had become. How easily it could be passed along without question. No one had stolen from me maliciously. They had simply assumed that my work belonged to the room. Later that day, I mentioned it casually to my manager. Not accusatory, just factual. I said, next time I'd appreciate being looped in if my work is being presented. She looked surprised, then slightly amused. "Oh," she said, "I didn't think you'd mind." "You're not really about titles or spotlight," it was said warmly, almost as praise. I nodded, smiled, let it go. That was the first small cut, not because of what was taken, but because of what was assumed. That my boundaries were flexible, my ambition was minimal, that my silence meant permission. After that, similar moments started to appear once I knew how to see them. A document circulated without my name. A decision was made using my recommendation, attributed to group consensus. A junior colleague was praised for owning a process I had designed years earlier. Each time I explained it away. This is how collaboration works. This is what being a team player looks like. I don't want to be petty, and no one else noticed, or if they did, they didn't consider it significant. These were professional environments, polite environments. Nothing obviously wrong was happening, but internally something had shifted. A quiet alertness, a sense that I was bleeding value in small, deniable increments. The hardest part was that I couldn't point to a single clear injustice, just a pattern of erasure so mild it could be argued away by anyone who benefited from it, including me. So I kept my composure, I kept delivering, I kept telling myself that making a fuss would cost me more than it was worth. But I started remembering everything, not with anger, with clarity. Because once you notice the first small cut, you start to see how often the blade returns, precise, polite, and completely unacknowledged. What makes subtle disrespect so effective is how easy it is to live with. Nothing dramatic changes overnight. No one suddenly treats you badly. Instead, the edges soften. Expectations blur. Small accommodations become defaults. And before you realize it, you're operating inside a version of your role that no one ever formally agreed to, but everyone now relies on. I told myself I was being professional, flexible, adaptable. Those words became shields I used to protect the situation from scrutiny. Every time something felt off, I translated it into something reasonable. They're under pressure. They didn't mean it that way. This isn't personal. And most of the time, those explanations were technically true. But what I didn't admit, at least not yet, was that the same behaviors kept repeating, and they always benefited the same people. I was consulted endlessly before decisions and excluded quietly afterward. I was invited into crises and left out of credit. I was trusted with execution and sidelined from strategy. Gradually, my job expanded in every direction except upward. People began to phrase requests as assumptions. "You'll probably handle this, right? You're best positioned to take this on. We'd be lost without you." Statements that sound flattering until you realize they are never followed by change. When I tried to set boundaries, even gently, I was met with confusion, as if I had violated an unspoken agreement. One colleague laughed once and said, "That doesn't sound like you," not unkindly, almost affectionately. That was the moment I understood how fixed my image had become. I wasn't seen as someone who could evolve. I was seen as someone who functioned. And I helped maintain that image because it felt safer than challenging it. Speaking up carried risk. Staying quiet felt neutral. I chose neutrality again and again, even as it chipped away at my sense of fairness. There were moments when I almost said something more. When I almost asked why a role had been created without considering me, when I almost pointed out that I was training people who would soon outrank me. But I swallowed those questions because I didn't want to seem resentful, or difficult, or emotional. Instead, I refined my coping mechanisms. I worked faster, I became more efficient, I anticipated needs before they were voiced. I made myself so useful that it felt impossible to ignore me. Ironically, that only deepened the problem. The more seamless I became, the less visible the labor was. The less disruption I caused, the less urgency anyone felt to address the imbalance. I was solving the very friction that might have forced change. I remember watching a colleague receive a promotion announcement during a team meeting. Applause, smiles. Someone joked that it was well-deserved. And it was. He was competent, ambitious, and visible. What no one mentioned was that I had onboarded him, built his workflows, and quietly corrected his early mistakes. That knowledge stayed in my chest, unspoken, heavy but controlled. After the meeting, he thanked me sincerely for my support. I congratulated him without hesitation, and when he asked if I was thinking about moving up too, I said, maybe someday. Even then, I wasn't lying. I just didn't believe someday was close. Disrespect, when normalized, stops feeling like an offense and starts feeling like a condition. Something you adapt to. Something you manage internally so others don't have to be uncomfortable. I had convinced myself that patience was wisdom, that endurance was strength, that staying calm was the same as staying powerful. But there's a difference between choosing restraint and being conditioned into it. At this point in the story, I hadn't reached a breaking point. There was no anger, no confrontation brewing, just a slow, quiet realization that the version of me everyone relied on was not the version that would ever be advanced. And I was still trying to decide whether that was acceptable or simply familiar. It took longer than I'd like to admit to understand that I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being positioned, not in a formal way. No one sat me down and explained it. But patterns, when repeated long enough, become roles. And my role had been quietly defined by everyone except me. I was the stabilizer, the person you leaned on when things became uncertain, the one who absorbed complexity so others could stay focused on their lanes. I was dependable to the point of predictability. And predictability, I learned, is comforting, but it's rarely promoted. When new initiatives were discussed, my name came up early. Not as a candidate to lead, but as someone who would support, advise, or help ensure continuity. My involvement was framed as a safeguard, not a trajectory. At first, I felt honored, trusted. Then I noticed something subtle but telling. Whenever a role involved visibility, authority, or risk, someone else was chosen. Often someone who asked for it, or someone who made their ambition legible. I didn't. So the narrative formed around me without resistance. Eleanor doesn't want that kind of pressure. Eleanor prefers stability. Eleanor is happy where she is. No one asked me if that was true. There was a meeting where leadership discussed restructuring, new titles, new reporting lines. I was invited, which felt promising. I listened carefully, contributed where it made sense, and even offered a solution that simplified a major transition. At the end, the director thanked me and said, "We'll need you to help whoever steps into this role. You're the institutional memory here." That was the moment it became undeniable. I wasn't being groomed, I was being preserved. My value was in my permanence, not my progression. I was the anchor that allowed others to move freely, and anchors don't get to travel. What made it more complex was that I understood why. From a systems perspective, it made sense. Removing me from my position would create friction. Promoting me would create a gap no one else could easily fill. So instead of being seen as someone to elevate, I was seen as someone to contain. And again, I had participated in this by being endlessly available, by never signaling limits, by confusing loyalty with self-erasure. I remember a conversation with a colleague who had recently moved into management. He said casually, "You're lucky. You don't have to deal with all this politics." I smiled, because that's what I always did. What I didn't say was that politics had been deciding my future the entire time. I just wasn't allowed to influence it. The role I was assigned came with unspoken expectations. Be calm, be fair, be helpful, don't disrupt. Be the person others rely on, not the person they compete with. And as long as I stayed within that role, I was praised. As soon as I hinted at wanting more, the room shifted. Not hostility, just discomfort, as if I had broken character. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. Because once you see the role clearly, you can no longer pretend you're choosing it freely. And that's when the question stopped being, "Why aren't they promoting me?" and became something much more important. What happens if I step out of the role they need me to play? The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no public dismissal, no email that crossed a line. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends into dozens of others, and that's why it took me a moment to recognize what had changed. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a request that had just come in. Urgent, of course. A problem in a system I had designed years earlier. The message was brief, almost casual, assuming I would drop what I was doing and fix it. No context, no acknowledgement, just expectation. As my hands hovered over the keyboard, I felt something unfamiliar. Resistance. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet pause where there used to be automatic compliance. I leaned back in my chair and reread the message. Then I looked at my calendar. 3 other priorities, all of which had also arrived labeled urgent, all of which were invisible to the people making the requests. For the first time, I didn't immediately start solving the problem. I just sat there. And in that stillness, a simple thought surfaced, uninvited but undeniable. They don't see my time as finite. That realization was small, but it landed with weight. It reframed everything that had come before it. The missed credits, the assumed availability, the way my role expanded without negotiation. It wasn't that they didn't respect me, it was that they had never been required to, because I never asked them to. I thought back over the years, how often I had stepped in early to prevent issues that would have forced hard conversations, how often I had shielded leadership from consequences, how often I had smoothed over dysfunction so well that it appeared not to exist. I had made myself frictionless, and frictionless things are easy to move around, or over. That afternoon, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I simply replied to the message with a question. What's the deadline, and who else is involved? It was a neutral response, professional, but it was different. The reply came back slower than usual. Then another message followed, slightly more detailed. A tone shift I recognized immediately, uncertainty. Nothing dramatic happened, but something internal had realigned. I realized I had been waiting for permission to change a dynamic that only existed because I upheld it. That night, I went home and wrote in my notebook, no complaints, observations. I listed every responsibility I held that wasn't in my job description. Every decision I made was influenced without authority. Every person who relied on me without advocating for me. The list was longer than I expected. I didn't feel angry reading it. I felt clear. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was good enough to advance and started asking whether the system had any incentive to let me. And once that question formed, I couldn't unsee the answer. The shift wasn't about becoming louder or tougher. It was about becoming deliberate, about recognizing that silence could be either a habit or a choice. That day marked the end of my unconscious compliance. What followed wasn't an immediate change. It was something slower, more controlled. Preparation. After that afternoon, I didn't transform into a different person. I didn't suddenly assert myself in meetings or challenge every assumption. On the surface, very little changed. But internally, silence stopped being automatic. Before, my quietness had been reflexive, a way of keeping things smooth, of avoiding unnecessary friction. Now it has become intentional. I started noticing when I stayed silent and why, whether it served me or merely served the system that had learned to rely on my restraint. The first few times I chose not to step in felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. When a conversation drifted toward a flawed conclusion, my instinct was to correct it immediately. When someone struggled with a problem I knew how to solve, my hands twitched toward the keyboard. And sometimes I still helped. This wasn't about withholding competence out of spite. It was about observing what happened when I didn't absorb every gap. What happened was revealing. Meetings ran longer. Decisions were postponed. Issues that used to be resolved quietly began to surface more visibly. People followed up more often, asking clarifying questions they'd never needed to ask before. No one connected this shift to me. They couldn't. I hadn't changed my demeanor or announced new boundaries. I was still polite, still responsive, just no longer preemptive. And that difference mattered. Silence, when chosen, creates space. Space for others to reveal their assumptions. Space for systems to show where they're fragile. space for accountability to land where it belongs. Of course, my silence was misinterpreted at first. A colleague asked if I was okay because I seemed less engaged. Another joked that I must be enjoying the quiet. I smiled, I nodded, I said nothing. They assumed my reduced visibility meant reduced investment. They mistook my restraint for disengagement. That was useful information, because it showed me how shallow their understanding of my role had been, how little they recognized the difference between presence and contribution. Behind the scenes, I was paying closer attention than ever. I listened more than I spoke. I documented patterns. I noted who stepped up and who waited for someone else to fill the gap. I also stopped volunteering for work that didn't move me forward. Not loudly, just subtly. If a request came in without clarity or ownership, I asked questions instead of offering solutions. If a task was outside my scope, I asked who was accountable for it. Each question was calm, reasonable, hard to argue with, and each one disrupted the unspoken expectation that I would simply handle things. I could feel the tension shift slightly, not hostility, but adjustment, like a structure redistributing weight. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was. No one pushed back aggressively. No one accused me of anything. They just recalibrated, slowly, unsure of the new boundaries but aware that something had changed. Silence had become leverage, not because it was passive, but because it was precise. I spoke when it mattered. I withheld when it didn't. I stopped translating chaos into order unless it was explicitly my responsibility. And in that space, I began to see something clearly for the first time. They had needed my silence to maintain the illusion that everything was working. Without it, the system started telling the truth. While things looked quieter on the surface, I was doing more thinking than ever before. What they never noticed was how intentional my attention had become. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was studying. The workflows, the dependencies, the informal power lines that determined whose voice mattered and whose didn't. I started to see the organization not as a hierarchy on paper, but as a living system held together by habits, assumptions, and a few key people who made it all look functional. I was one of those people, and I wasn't the only one who knew it, but I was the only one who had never used it consciously. I began documenting everything. Not in a way that looked defensive or dramatic, just notes, dates, decisions. Who relied on what and when? Which processes lived only in my head? Which external partners contacted me directly because they didn't trust anyone else to follow through? I noticed how often my name appeared in CC lines when something went wrong and how rarely it appeared when something went right. I also noticed something else. How few people actually understood the systems they oversaw. Titles suggested ownership, but knowledge told a different story. People made confident decisions without grasping second-order consequences. They depended on buffers, on people like me, to quietly correct course. So I stopped correcting course preemptively. Instead, I let questions linger. I asked for confirmation in writing. I looped in the appropriate stakeholders instead of shielding them from complexity. I made my work visible without making it loud. At the same time, I started preparing myself for the possibility that this would not resolve internally. That was a difficult realization to accept. I had stayed because I believed in the work, because I valued stability, because I told myself loyalty would eventually be reciprocated. But now I began to see that the organization didn't have a mechanism to reward someone in my position without destabilizing itself. So I prepared options. I updated my documentation, not just for continuity, but for clarity. I made sure my contributions were traceable. I strengthened relationships outside my immediate team, quiet conversations, professional check-ins, nothing that looked like networking in the traditional sense. I also revisited my own skills with a more honest lens. Not what my job required, but what the market valued. I filled gaps deliberately, took on learning that no one had asked for, but that expanded my leverage. All of this happened without announcement, without visible ambition, without complaint. From the outside, I was still Eleanor, The reliable one, the calm presence. Inside, I was building a clear map of where I stood and what would happen if I moved. They never noticed because they didn't need to. As long as I continued to function, there was no reason to look closer. Systems rarely examine their foundations unless something shifts. And I wasn't planning to shake anything violently. I was planning to step away cleanly. What they never noticed was that my preparation wasn't about leaving in anger. It was about leaving without chaos and understanding exactly who would feel the absence and how. Not to punish them, but to finally see the truth of my value reflected back without me having to explain it. The reveal didn't come as a surprise. That's what made it so steady, so clarifying. By the time I reached it, I had already suspected the truth. I just hadn't allowed myself to name it yet. It happened during a routine check-in with an external partner, one of the longest-standing relationships I managed. We were reviewing timelines, nothing unusual. Near the end of the call, he paused and said, almost casually, "If you ever move on from this company, let me know. We'd follow you." He said it as a fact, not a compliment. I thanked him politely and moved on. But after the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat very still. That sentence echoed, not because of ego, but because it confirmed something I had been circling for months. My value wasn't tied to my title, or my department, or even my organization. It was tied to my judgment, my reliability, my ability to hold complex systems together without spectacle. And that value was portable. I tested the idea quietly, not with mass applications or dramatic outreach, just a few careful conversations, trusted contacts, industry peers, people who knew my work but had no stake in keeping me where I was. The response was consistent. They were surprised I hadn't advanced further. They assumed I had chosen stability over growth. They spoke to me as an equal, sometimes as someone ahead of them. That contrast was stark. Inside my organization, I was seen as a constant. Outside of it, I was seen as an asset. That was the private reveal. No celebration followed it, no rush of vindication, just a calm, grounding clarity. The system I was in couldn't reflect my value accurately because it depended on my being undervalued to function smoothly. I realized then that waiting for recognition there wasn't patience, it was self-denial. I went back to my notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of a clean page. They know what I do. They just don't want to reorganize around it. Once that was clear, the rest became simpler. Not easier, but simpler. I stopped hoping for internal correction. I stopped framing my restraint as virtue. I stopped interpreting inaction as oversight. And most importantly, I stopped needing anyone inside the system to validate my worth. The reveal was private because it had to be. The moment I shared it, the dynamic would change. So I held it quietly, the way you hold a compass when you finally know which direction you're walking. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. Once you see your options clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. That was where I found myself, not in crisis, not in desperation, but at a crossroads that required honesty. I could stay where I was and continue to be quietly relied upon, hoping that clarity would eventually translate into change. I could push internally, ask harder questions, risk disrupting the balance I had helped maintain. Or I could step away entirely, carrying my value somewhere it would be recognized without negotiation. Each option came with consequences. Staying meant comfort and familiarity, but also a slow erosion of self-respect. I knew that now. I had already outgrown the narrative that patience alone would resolve structural imbalance. Remaining would require me to accept the role as permanent or to fight against it openly. Pushing internally was tempting in theory. I rehearsed conversations in my head, calm, factual discussions about scope, impact, and progression. But every version ended the same way. Even if I succeeded, the system would have to rearrange itself around me. And systems resist that. Promotions are easier than transformations. Titles are easier than redistributing power. And then there was the third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider seriously until now. Leaving, not dramatically, not as an act of protest, but deliberately, with timing and intention. I thought about what each path asked of me emotionally. Staying asked me to shrink my awareness. Pushing asked me to expend energy correcting something I didn't break. Leaving asked me to accept uncertainty, but also alignment. The decision point wasn't marked by urgency. No ultimatum forced my hand. That was what made it honest. I wasn't being pushed out. I was choosing whether to stay invisible by design. One evening, after another long day of solving problems that weren't mine to own, I opened my notebook again. I wrote 3 columns: stay, push, leave. Under each, I listed what I would gain and what I would lose. The leave column scared me the most, and that's how I knew it was the one that mattered. Fear, I realized, wasn't a warning in this case. It was a signal that I was approaching the edge of a self-imposed boundary, the one that had kept me safe, useful, and unseen. I didn't decide that night, but something irreversible happened. I stopped negotiating with myself about whether I deserved more. The question became logistical, not emotional. How, when, under what conditions? Once a decision shifts from if to how, momentum follows naturally. I closed the notebook and felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, resolve. I hadn't told anyone yet. There was no reason to. The decision was still mine, and for now, it lived quietly inside me, steady and unmoving, like something set in motion that no longer needed discussion. Once the decision was made, there was no rush to announce it. That surprised me at first. I had expected urgency, maybe even impatience. Instead, what followed was a kind of measured calm. I wasn't escaping, I was transitioning, and transitions, I learned, are strongest when they're quiet. I began putting practical pieces in place, carefully, methodically. I reviewed contracts, I noted notice periods, I mapped dependencies, not to create disruption, but to understand it. Knowledge is leverage, and I wanted mine to be clear, not emotional. At work, I stayed consistent, still reliable, still composed, no dramatic withdrawal. That was important. Any visible shift would invite scrutiny, questions, and attempts to reframe the situation. I didn't want persuasion. I wanted accuracy. So I moved in silence. I accepted a few exploratory conversations outside the organization, spaced weeks apart. I asked thoughtful questions. I listened more than I spoke. I was transparent about my values, not my frustrations. I wasn't looking for an escape hatch. I was looking for alignment. And I found it. Not immediately, but enough to know it existed. Inside the organization, things continued as they always had. Requests arrived, assumptions persisted. People leaned on me without realizing they were leaning on something that was slowly shifting away from its original position. I noticed how much of the system depended on my quiet coordination, how many processes lacked true ownership, how many decisions assumed I would fill in the gaps later. No one noticed because nothing had broken yet. I documented what I could, cleanly, professionally, not as a warning, but as a record. If someone asked how something worked, I explained it once, clearly, and pointed them to where it was written. I stopped being the living manual. That change, too, went largely unnoticed. People appreciated the documentation without questioning why it was suddenly necessary. Silence protected me. It allowed me to act without being framed, without being labeled disloyal or emotional, without triggering premature attempts to fix the situation with surface-level concessions. Because by then, the issue wasn't compensation or title, it was trust. Trust that my contribution would be met with proportional recognition, that my growth wouldn't threaten the system, that my silence wouldn't be mistaken for surrender. That trust had already been broken, quietly, over the years. So I kept moving, one step at a time, nothing flashy, nothing final yet. From the outside, I was still exactly who they thought I was, and that misperception gave me all the space I needed. The first consequences didn't arrive with impact. They arrived in confusion. Small delays, unanswered questions, a few meetings that ended without resolution, nothing anyone could point to and say, this is the problem. But something had shifted, and people could feel it even if they couldn't name it. I noticed it in the tone of the messages, more follow-ups, more just checking in. People who used to assume I'd already handled something were now asking whether it was done. When I replied with clear status updates, accurate, complete, but no longer anticipatory, threads extended longer than usual. The system was experiencing friction it hadn't felt in years. At first, it was brushed off as workload and timing or coincidence. Leadership didn't intervene. There was no reason yet. Nothing was broken, just slower. Then a process failed quietly. Not catastrophically, just enough to require explanation. A vendor escalated a question I would normally have resolved in minutes. A report surfaced inconsistencies because no one had double-checked the assumptions I used to catch instinctively. In the review meeting, people spoke carefully. No blame, just confusion about how something so routine had slipped. I listened, took notes, answered questions when asked. No one connected these moments to me. How could they? I was still doing my job, still present, still professional. I hadn't withdrawn effort, I had withdrawn excess. And excess had been holding everything together. I could see the discomfort building, not as anger, but as unease. The kind that arises when a system realizes it has been depending on something it doesn't fully understand. Colleagues started reaching out more directly. Can you take a look at this? Do you have a minute? I helped when it made sense, but I no longer preempted. Each time I chose not to fill a gap, the gap became visible. And visibility changes accountability. Leadership began asking broader questions, not about me, but about processes, ownership, coverage. Conversations shifted from "Eleanor usually handles that" to "who owns this?" That distinction mattered, because once ownership is questioned, assumptions lose their power. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. No vindication, just a steady confirmation of what I already knew. My role had been structural, not supplemental. Removing even a fraction of it altered the system's behavior. Still, no one panicked. Not yet. These were early signals, easy to rationalize. I remained quiet, steady, available within scope. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as exposure. And exposure, once it starts, tends to accelerate. By the time concern turned into urgency, the window for simple fixes had already closed. It began with a tone shift from leadership. Not alarm, yet, but focus. Meetings were scheduled with tighter agendas. Questions became more pointed. There was a subtle but unmistakable sense that something was wrong, even if no one could articulate exactly what it was. They started talking about resilience, about single points of failure, about knowledge distribution, words that would have made me smile months earlier because I had been living inside those risks for years. Suddenly, my calendar began to fill. Check-ins, strategy discussions, requests for context. People wanted me to explain things I had been managing quietly for a long time. I answered calmly, clearly, without embellishment. I pointed to the documentation. I described processes as they existed, not as people assumed they did. Each explanation revealed another layer of dependency. The realization moved slowly across faces in the room, not shock, but dawning recognition that certain outcomes hadn't been the result of strong systems, but of one person compensating for their absence. Still, no one named it directly. Instead, there were suggestions, new roles, task forces, ideas about redistribution, all of them framed around continuity, not acknowledgement. How do we keep things running, not how did this happen? Someone asked, what would it take to make this more sustainable? I answered honestly. Time, training, and clarity around ownership. Those things require investment, and urgency makes people wish for shortcuts. That's when the late attempts began. A conversation about growth. A hint at future opportunities. Language that gestured toward recognition without committing to it. I listened respectfully, but I could hear the mismatch immediately. They weren't responding to me. They were responding to disruption, and that distinction mattered. It was too late to fix it because the issue wasn't a missing incentive. It was a missing foundation. Years of imbalance can't be corrected with a conversation or a promise. Trust, once eroded quietly, doesn't return on demand. I saw the panic underneath the professionalism. Not fear of losing me as a person, but fear of losing what I had been holding together. No one raised their voice. No one blamed me. In fact, everyone was kind. But kindness without accountability doesn't rebuild trust. I realized then that even if I stayed, things would never be the same. They couldn't be. The illusion had cracked. And once a system becomes aware of its fragility, it either changes deeply or looks for something to patch over the discomfort. Neither path felt like mine to manage anymore. I remained calm, clear, consistent, and quietly, irrevocably, already gone. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no defensive posture, no emotional release waiting for its cue. It took place in a small conference room with glass walls, late in the afternoon when the office was already thinning out. The timing felt intentional, quiet, controlled, meant to contain whatever this conversation was supposed to resolve. My manager and a senior director were there, both professional, both careful. They began by acknowledging my contributions, not vaguely this time. Specifically, processes I had stabilized, relationships I had maintained, risks I had quietly mitigated over the years. It was the most accurate description of my work I had ever heard spoken aloud inside that building. I listened without reacting. Then came the pause, the one where I could feel them deciding how direct to be. They asked me how I was feeling about my role. I answered honestly but calmly. I said I had realized my responsibilities had grown far beyond my position, and that the gap between contribution and advancement had become impossible to ignore. No accusation, no history lesson, just a fact. They nodded. One of them said they wished we had talked sooner. I didn't contradict them, but I didn't accept the implication either, because we had talked, just not in ways that required action. They spoke about future possibilities, about reevaluating the structure, about how much they valued me. And then, gently, they asked the question they had been avoiding. Are you thinking about leaving? I met their eyes and said yes. There it was, clean, undramatic, unavoidable. The room didn't tense. It stilled. They asked if there was anything they could do to change my mind. I paused, not for effect, but because the answer deserved care. I told them that the issue wasn't one decision or one role. It was years of being positioned as essential but not expandable. That staying would mean returning to a dynamic I had already outgrown. They listened. I believe they meant to. But listening late doesn't undo patterns early. There was no argument, no attempt to guilt me into staying, just a quiet acceptance that something had shifted beyond negotiation. When the meeting ended, they thanked me for my honesty. I thanked them for the conversation, and that was it. No dramatic exit, no emotional collapse afterward. Just a steady sense of alignment. The confrontation had happened without heat because there was nothing left to fight for, only clarity to acknowledge. When I think about who I am now, the change isn't loud or visible in the ways people expect transformation to be. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't harden. I didn't become someone unrecognizable. What changed was my relationship to my own value. I no longer confuse being needed with being respected. I don't measure my worth by how smoothly I can compensate for broken systems, and I don't stay silent to preserve comfort at the expense of clarity. In my new role, I'm still calm, still observant, still deliberating, but the difference is structural. My responsibilities are matched by authority. My contributions are named, not absorbed. Expectations are explicit, not assumed. And perhaps most importantly, my silence is understood, not exploited. I no longer overfunction to prove stability. I don't preemptively solve problems that aren't mine to own. When I speak, it's because my voice is relevant, not because I'm filling a gap. There's no bitterness in this. I don't look back at my previous workplace with resentment. I understand why the system behaved the way it did. Systems optimize for continuity, not fairness. But understanding doesn't require self-sacrifice. I've learned that quiet people aren't invisible by nature. They're made invisible by environments that reward volume over substance. And once you see that clearly, you have a choice: to adapt endlessly or to reposition yourself where quiet strength is legible. I chose the second. Who I am now is someone who pays attention earlier, who sets boundaries before they become ultimatums, who recognizes when loyalty has become inertia. And when I'm underestimated now, it doesn't sting the way it used to. It registers as information because I know what I carry and I know how to move it. There's a moral that people often expect from stories like this. Something sharp, something declarative, a lesson that fits neatly into a sentence and feels satisfying to repeat. But the truth is quieter. What I learned wasn't that hard work always pays off, or that silence is noble, or that patience is a virtue. What I learned is that systems rarely change out of gratitude, they change out of necessity, or not at all. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed calm, capable, and consistent, fairness would eventually catch up, that someone would notice the imbalance and feel compelled to correct it, that my restraint would be read as strength. Sometimes it is, but just as often, restraint is read as consent. There is a difference between humility and self-erasure, between loyalty and inertia, between being indispensable and being trapped by your own usefulness. I lived inside those blurred lines for years because they were comfortable, because they were familiar, because they didn't force me to risk anything, until they did. The quiet truth is this: I wasn't punished for speaking up. I was limited in staying silent too long. And when I finally moved, I didn't do it to teach anyone a lesson. I did it to stop teaching myself the wrong one. I don't regret the years I spent being reliable. They shaped my discipline, my discernment, my sense of responsibility, but I also don't romanticize them. Endurance without direction doesn't become wisdom on its own. It just becomes a habit. If there's anything I hope stays with you after this story, it's this. Being underestimated is not a moral advantage. It's a condition. And conditions don't change unless someone decides they should. You don't need to announce that decision. You don't need to justify it loudly. You don't need to burn anything down to step away from it. Sometimes the most powerful shift is simply choosing not to continue where you are no longer seen clearly. I'm not louder now. I'm not harsher. I'm not interested in dominance for its own sake. I'm aligned. And alignment has a way of doing what confrontation never could. Before we end, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever stayed quiet because it felt easier than being seen? And if so, what do you think that silence has cost you over time?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.